Hi, everybody. It's your teacher, Meg. We're discussing the your responses to discussion number 13, which is all about interpreting Picasso's Guernica, the painting by Pablo Picasso that features the horrific events that happened in the Basque region of Guernica. And so you were asked to think about the symbols behind it and then an overall interpretation of it. So let's start with the symbols. Um, so there's a lot of different little parts that you can look at, and a lot of you connected with them similarly. So let's start with Alondra, who's talking about the hand that has a torch in it. And she pointed out that it can be trying to look for help in all the bloodshed by with that light, right? And she is pushing her hand ahead in desperation. And there's a look of determination as she moves forward, not ready to give up, but there looks to be fear also. So a lot of great observations there, Alondra. That sense of pushing with that hand, it does look like a really powerful kind of like gesture, right? Of pushing that torch forward, and your idea that it has a light that can help. Um, you know, um, what the horror that's going on, all the bloodshed. And I love that idea that there's desperation, but also determination, because it is a real powerful kind of gesture that she makes there. So thanks for that, Alondra. Caitlin pointed out also the way that that hand and the torch might go with the eye, another visual that a lot of you connected to, where it kind of looks like a lamp or a light fixture almost hanging, but it also looks like an eye, and the light that's coming off of it kind of look like lashes, and it's just a really interesting, compelling part of it. And so Caitlin made the connection that the that hand could symbolize lighting things up so that the eye can see more clearly. So that eye has a lot of connection with us as individuals, because that's what we use to see, right? So we immediately kind of connect the concept of sight with that, and so the idea of we need light on everything to observe it in any way at all. So great connection of those two symbols, Caitlin. Sandra thought of the light in terms of symbolizing hope. In the artwork, you can see several people looking towards the light. The people are in darkness, but they seek the light. So that's a wonderful analogy there of being in darkness and looking towards the light. So that line of sight, again, we've seen that before, is very, very compelling. As humans, we want to connect with anybody else's line of sight, like we look in the same place. And that there's more than one person looking at that light source makes it really compelling to us as a symbol. So we're going to read a lot of meaning into that. So good observation, Sandra. Hannah pointed out the bull as a symbol, and that's very clearly a big part of it, right? And there's also a lot of connection with Picasso and bull imagery. He himself thought that the bull was a particularly good symbol for himself. So he includes it in a lot of different paintings. So it's a symbol that he relies upon a lot. So a lot of you connected with it as well. Um, the Hannah says that the cow, although is not wanting to fight, is forced into war because war consumes everything in its path. So that's a really good connection to the idea of the collateral damage of war. Like even things that would normally be outside of war, like nature and an animal, are always pulled into it because there's no escaping the all-consuming nature of war. So really good, compelling point, Hannah. Sarah brought up the idea of the bull in a different interpretation, saying the bull looks calm and can stand for the unaware or unobservant members of society. And that's an important way to look at it too, right? That even in the midst of, there's a lot of politics around this event, right? And so maybe a lot of people were caught unaware, or maybe also represents a kind of apathy, a kind of non-reaction, because the bull looks really like it doesn't have a lot of intensity to it, right? It's a very kind of static part of the imagery. So that was an interesting way to look at it, Sarah. Aylin has brought our attention to the figure in the building that's at the far right. And she points out the figure on the far right of the painting seemingly trapped in the burning structure. This figure surrounded by flames could symbolize the feeling of being trapped in a war. And that definitely that sense of helplessness, of like things kind of caving in on you, of having nowhere to turn during a time of great trauma and distress. That's a very human kind of reaction to it. So, Aileen, I think that was a great way to connect with that particular symbol. Michael has a different take on it. Oh no, Michael's, this is about the horse, right? So we've got the bull, and then the other animal is the horse, and that horse is really intense. If you look at it, it's a large part of the composition, and it's also really connected to warrior imagery of the past. The Romans had leaders on horseback. If you remember the portrait of Marcus Aurelius on horseback, the Greeks used them, the High Renaissance used them to depict the intensity of battle. So Michael is connecting it with an idea of peace, right? Horses, again, is a kind of neutral, peaceful animal. He said he thinks that the horse represents peace in Spain and feels way because the horse is being stabbed through its body, destroying the peace. So that's a wonderful kind of imagery you connect with, Michael. And that there's this kind of peaceful animal that's being just violated horribly by the war and the violence that the body of the horse has suffered. And so that's a great connection to, or an allegory, it's a great example of an allegory, to Spain itself and the physical trauma that it's suffering. So good point, Michael. Sarah, again, connecting with the broken sword, that I think is a really powerful symbol. Is down at the bottom, the fallen soldier is holding a sword, and you'll see the jagged edge of it where it's broken. And a really interesting, I think, thoughtful reflection on that, Sarah. The broken sword could symbolize how weapons, regardless of how invincible they make us feel, can be broken and lives can be lost. So I feel like that's such a great observation. There's almost nothing that can't be broken, right? But we make these things that give us a sense, and probably a false sense of power and invincibility. And yet, what happened to it? It shattered, and it lies there shattered on the ground. So good observation, Sarah. And then Jasmine brought up my favorite symbol, which really kind of goes with that broken sword, because in the soldier's hand, there is a flower. It's a very, very tiny flower. It's very small and done with just the tiniest, very thin, delicate line. It's probably the least obvious thing in the entire painting. But to me, it's incredibly powerful. And Jasmine connected with that too. It's directly in the middle. So it's not in the middle this way, but it's in the middle this way. So she's connecting with the idea of peacemaker. And I think that's using nature as always being this thing that's peaceful and neutral and gentle, especially flowers. I think too, also we might have a connection with some of the countercultural movements in the 1960s use flowers, right? Flower power, and they use the flower imagery in a lot of their peace posters. So thank you for pointing that out, Jasmine. The that little tiny, very powerful flower. I'm reminded of I think it was a Life magazine photograph of peace protesters putting flowers into the muzzles of rifles being held by I think National Guard soldiers. So it's small and it's fragile, but it's can be very powerful. So I'm glad you brought that up. And then to the idea of interpretation of the whole, like putting all of those symbols together. So a lot of you had some great collective ideas here. Laura pointed out the poetry. I love this association here, Laura, of using poetry to to describe what Guernica is doing. When it comes to Guernica as a conglomeration of symbols and a sort of poetic formation. I love that because poetry is very indirect, right? It uses a lot of illusion and ways that we're going to react to words rather than making things explicit. And I think that's exactly what Picasso is doing here. So wonderful connection and parallel between the two. Catherine made what I thought was a really interesting point that, and I wanted to bring this out because it's it's important. I think Catherine says, I believe that because of my young age, I still have a lot to learn. That if I came back to review this painting in 5 years, I would be 20. Then I may have a whole different perspective on it. Absolutely, Catherine, you totally will. And that's the wonderful thing about paintings that, and this is what the point I'm trying to get across about interpretation. There's never one right, correct, static, eternal interpretation of any work of art. It's always a reflection of us and who we are and where we are and what we bring to it. So yes, Catherine, in 5 years, you will bring something entirely different to this painting and you will get something entirely different out of it. So, I love that you made that point. Emma made a great point that interpretation is really just about noticing. So Emma points out, while reading the article on this, I learned to notice things that I would never thought of, but because I haven't been trained to see those aspects of the painting in such a complex way. And I hope this makes everybody think about the fact that, yes, there's a complex way of looking at and interpreting Picasso's Guernica, but it's not predicated on any special knowledge. You don't have to be an art historian. All you have to do is notice things. Look for those little details. They're put there in a way so that we all have access to them. We all can notice them, react to them, and then stitch them together to make a larger interpretation. So the power of the interpretation is really just in noticing, and I think that's one of the reasons I love to study art, because there's something extremely powerful in taking note of details, and practicing that in art gives us a way to apply that skill in all areas of our life. So that's one of the things I really enjoy about art, being an art historian. And Daniel points out that the whole interpretation can be looked at as the horrors of war. Just really pointed out these symbols are all very blatant with what they mean on their own, but together they send a powerful message about the true and senseless horrors of war. So you're right, Daniel. Each image is so powerful and kind of clear, right? Like a broken sword and a person crying in pain. Those are very, very clear. And when you put them together, you definitely can't avoid that sense of the horror of the war. McKenna pointed out the idea of keeping the stories of survivors, and that survivors, I think that's a much more modern sensibility. The 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 function of survivors in our culture as being the keepers of the memories, and we have a culture that's learned to kind of document. As she pointed out, we watch documentaries of survivors. Their stories are so upsetting to hear, but it's really, really important to document that, right? To keep it alive so that we learn from it. So I love this connection with the survivorship, like this culture of having been through something and wanting to hold on to the meaning. So Charlotte brings up a really classic point. I think this is what Carl Jung would call an archetypal point, um, that there's this concept of gods and chaos, and there you can look at origin stories from any culture, any religion, and you'll find this theme that without the gods, there's like utter chaos. And so Charlotte has picked this up, saying the light eye at the top is one of few things in this painting that doesn't look chaotic. It simply seems to be viewing everything that is happening below. Maybe this has to do with religion, with a god looking down on all the people and all the crazy situations occurring. So that eye kind of symbol in the middle has often been interpreted as a kind of all-seeing eye, which people then connect to the concept of a god. And that's such a great classic, time-honored symbolism and interpretation that there's without gods or humans left to their own devices, just pretty much come up with chaos. And gods are always needed to kind of step in the event of great chaos. So I love too how Isabel turned this into a very personal interpretation, because she also noticed that sense of chaos, and she said the way what she brought to her personal perspective that she brought to this painting was that she says, I'm a person who likes things to be in order and neat. The painting makes me think of the opposite, as there seems to be so much chaos. So like that chaos for Isabel is especially like grating right on her nerves, and that really informed her personal interpretation of the work of art. So thanks, Isabel, for sharing that. And then I love Daniel Garrity's perspective on this, about looking at war in a very unfiltered way, in a way that's very honest and truthful. He says, I'm really fascinated by war stories, but not the ones that glorify it. I want to see and hear the stories that try their best to express the true pain of war and what the people involved experienced. And I think that's a thoughtful way to approach it, Daniel, that there's so many ways that narratives can be imposed on the facts and on the representation that give it a sense of glorification that has some greater meaning. But the true nature of it is pain and collateral damage and trauma. And so I share that with you, Daniel, an appreciation for things that um, don't cast things in an ideological light, but rather look at them in a very kind of honest and showing all the facts kind of way. So interesting way to interpret it. Hannah brought up the issue of PTSD, which is very meaningful when it comes to experiencing trauma. And we know a lot more about PTSD than we did, especially at the time where Picasso was painting this. It was right before World War II, and in World War II, excuse me, they didn't call it PTSD; they called it battle fatigue, which really sounds a lot more neutral, right? Like you're just tired of battle. But the post-traumatic stress disorder really makes it clear that after trauma, there's a whole series, there's a whole cascade of um, ways that it affects a person. And I love that Hannah pointed out that she's not directly affected by war. The military, she does has witnessed people with PTSD, and I like that there's a sensitivity there. So Hannah's bringing that newfound sensitivity of our culture into the interpretation of this particular piece. And then Victoria points out a really sad and compelling point that there are no true winners in war, that both sides suffer major losses. Everyone in the artwork truly looks to be suffering. And so the idea that Victoria is bringing is that war equals a loss all around, no matter what. And so that's an interesting personal perspective. And then I think my favorite interpretation is by Sandra. And Sandra really does one of those things that's just so essential when you're talking about complicated arguments. She pinpoints it in a precise turn of phrase. And she talks about the duality. And I think here's what she wrote. I think this shows all the qualities humanity has. Humans can be both hopeful and hurtful. The duality is what makes us human. I love that phrase, Sandra. It's so thoughtful. It's so concise. It's so right on point. The duality is what makes us human. If there's nothing else that defines us, it's that capacity that we have for both evil and good, for darkness and lightness. And then you went on to connect that with our own current time period. And I think that's what's so again so meaningful about studying art, is that this piece made so many decades ago still resonates today, because you brought it to today's politics, Sandra. I think it was influenced by my daily experiences, especially with the turmoil in our country. We can see the duality of humans. The split between individuals can especially be seen in politics. And we've definitely come through a political season that was extremely polarizing. We're going to have another one with the upcoming election. And I think that's such a really profound explanation of the two sides of humans. So thank you, Sandra, for that. So a lot of interpretations, all of them very important, all of them very meaningful. I hope you all got a lot of new perspectives by seeing what other people brought to their own interpretation of the issue. Okay, thanks so much, everybody. See you online.